We are looking at a situation right now that is defined by its sheer scale.
Yeah,
And honestly, it's absolute unpredictability.
truly.
I mean, if you just think about the entire geopolitical landscape of the Middle East, the established borders, the fragile alliances.
The decades-old stalemate.
Exactly. All of it is currently suspended in midair. We are talking about the massive U.S. and Israeli military campaign against Iran, which is officially dubbed Operation Epic Fury.
Right.
And the consensus across all the analysis we are dissecting today is totally unanimous on this. This is, without a doubt, the most volatile, potentially world-altering moment in the region since the 1979 Iranian Revolution.
It really is a watershed moment. I mean, you can trace lines from the events happening this very second directly to the global economy, to domestic political survival in multiple capitals, and, frankly, to the fundamental architecture of how superpowers will wage war in the 21st century. The ripple effects are touching every single corner of the globe right now.
So, welcome to the Deep Dive. If you are joining us, your mission today, and our mission, is to unpack a staggeringly thick stack of sources to try and make sense of this massive conflict.
You've got a lot to get through.
We really do. We've got a wide array of materials in front of us. We are looking at dense political analysis, historical op-eds, diplomatic news reports.
And those strategic forecasting documents.
Yeah, the forecasting documents that read like science fiction but are literally happening in real time. The goal here is to cut through the daily noise. We want to look past the breaking headlines, the frantic press conferences, and the social media spin to help you understand the structural forces at play.
Because the headlines only give you the what. You know, they tell you a strike happened or a speech was made. We want to dig into the why and the what's next.
Exactly.
So over the course of this discussion, we are going to be previewing materials that cover the military analysis of the operation's incredibly ambitious goals.
Right.
We'll look at the deeply contrasting opinions on the targeted assassination of Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. We'll cover the diplomatic fallout involving global superpowers like China, Russia, and Turkey. And we'll get into some genuinely fascinating strategic blueprints for an entirely reshaped Middle East.
Now, before we go any further, I need to make a really crucial disclaimer for you, the listener. The sources we are unpacking today contain highly polarized political viewpoints.
Naturally, yeah.
That is just the nature of a conflict of this magnitude. We have articles that champion this war as a vital, necessary defense of the free world. And we have sharp, aggressive criticisms framing the entire operation as a destructive, dangerous overreach.
Right.
So we want to be absolutely clear. As your guides on this deep dive, we are not taking any sides.
Not at all.
We are not endorsing any political viewpoints, be they left-wing, right-wing, or anything in between. We are here strictly to impartially analyze, report on, and synthesize the ideas contained in the original source material. Our only agenda is helping you understand the arguments that are shaping global policy right now.
And that is a vital framework for us to operate within. We are treating these sources as artifacts of the current geopolitical debate.
Yeah.
And to truly understand that debate, you know, we have to examine the arguments on their own terms, dissecting the logic they use, regardless of whether that logic is ultimately proven right or wrong by history.
So let's jump right into the deep end. We have to start with the sheer ambition of Operation Epic Fury colliding with the physical reality of the Middle East.
The outset.
Right. When President Trump announced this campaign, the list of U.S. and Israeli goals wasn't just a tactical adjustment. It was a fundamental rewiring of the region.
It was massive.
We are talking about destroying Iran's navy, completely eliminating its nuclear capability, ending all of its support for proxy militias across the region, and perhaps most ambitiously sparking a citizen uprising to overthrow the regime from within.
The word ambitious almost undersells it. When you analyze that list of objectives, what immediately jumps out from the military analysis is the glaring ambiguity of how you actually measure success.
Right, because how do you know when you're done?
Exactly. If you are a military planner, you need achievable milestones. If the commander-in-chief says destroy the Navy, well, that is a kinetic, measurable goal.
You can count ships.
Right. You have satellite imagery. You can count how many frigates, fast attack craft, and submarines are at the bottom of the ocean or burning in a port. You can check that box. But then you move to the next item on the list, destroy the nuclear capability.
Yeah.
How do you definitively destroy a program that is largely based on intellectual capital.
You can't just bomb away knowledge. If you destroy a centrifuge, you haven't destroyed the idea of a centrifuge.
Precisely. And the strategic forecasting documents highlight this exact paradox. Nuclear knowledge is entirely intangible. You can use bunker buster munitions to obliterate the physical infrastructure, the enriched uranium stockpiles, the cascades of centrifuges, the underground laboratories.
Sure.
But the physicists, the engineers, the metallurgists who know how to build and operate those systems are still there. And the material explicitly notes that they can replace those physical assets.
Because we've seen them do it before.
Exactly. We have a clear historical precedent for this. Look back at the previous strikes in 2025. Those operations successfully damaged key Iranian facilities. Did it end the program?
No, it just drove it underground.
Right. Iran simply adapted. They moved their most sensitive operations even deeper underground into mountainsides that conventional munitions can't penetrate. They decentralized their supply chains. So, claiming the destruction of a nuclear program from the air is a highly subjective, incredibly fragile metric of victory.
And it gets even messier when you look at the goal of ending proxy support. We are talking about a vast decentralized network. Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, Kataib Hezbollah in Iraq.
It's everywhere.
The analysis points out that the financial and logistical networks funding these groups are intentionally covert and highly resilient.
It's the Hydra problem. The analysis suggests that Iran could easily adopt a strategy of strategic patience. They could simply pause their material support temporarily, let the immediate bombing campaign run its course,
Absorb the damage,
and then quietly resume their supply lines months later through different channels. Unless you achieve total catastrophic regime collapse, which is the absolute highest possible bar for success, defining when you have definitively ended proxy support becomes a political talking point rather than a verifiable military reality.
Which brings up a fascinating contradiction that one of the historical op-eds dives deeply into. And this is something you, as a listener, have probably noticed if you follow politics over any significant length of time. We have an administration that explicitly campaigned on keeping the U.S. out of foreign conflicts.
The America First platform.
Right, promising an America First non-interventionist approach.
Yeah.
Yet here we are, launching one of the most expansive military campaigns in modern history.
Yeah.
Why is it that presidents who campaign on a platform of peace, restraint, or ending forever wars almost universally become hawkish once they're actually in the Oval Office?
It is one of the most consistent phenomena in modern American political history. And the author of this particular piece argues brilliantly that it is not about the individual character of the president. It is a structural feature of the presidency itself.
The office changes them.
Exactly. The historical track record is remarkably, undeniably consistent. When candidates are on the campaign trail, they view foreign policy through the lens of domestic political advantage. They capitalize on war fatigue. But the office fundamentally changes them.
Let's trace that lineage, because the examples the text provides are striking. Start with Bill Clinton in the early 90s.
Right. Clinton actively criticized George H.W. Bush's foreign policy. He painted Bush as obsessed with international affairs at the expense of the American economy.
It's the economy, stupid.
That was the defining mantra. He promised to turn inward, to focus on domestic renewal. But what happens when he takes the oath? He ends up using war powers authority extensively.
Kosovo, right?
He authorizes the massive NATO air campaign in Kosovo. He launches cruise missile strikes on the Al-Shifa pharmaceutical factory in Sudan. He orders strikes aimed at Osama bin Laden in Afghanistan. The domestic-focused candidate became a prolific user of military force abroad.
And the pendulum swings again with George W. Bush.
Yeah.
If you go back to the 2000 debates, he was campaigning specifically against the Clinton era's nation-building exercises.
He wanted a humble foreign policy.
He explicitly promised a humble foreign policy, arguing the U.S. shouldn't be the world's policeman.
Exactly. He wanted to project strength, but avoid entanglement. Then the trauma of September 11th happens, and the entire paradigm shatters.
Right.
The candidate of a humble foreign policy launches the massive trillion-dollar multi-decade wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, explicitly engaging in the most expansive, ambitious nation-building projects the United States had attempted since the Marshall Plan.
Which naturally paved the way for Barack Obama. I mean, his entire initial political rise, his separation from Hillary Clinton in the 2008 primary, was fueled by his vocal, principled opposition to the Iraq War. He was the anti-war candidate who promised to bring the troops home.
And he did withdraw the bulk of combat troops from Iraq initially. He was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, largely on the promise of a new era of diplomacy.
But then you look at the record.
Look at the administrative record detailed in the sources. The realities of governance set in. He authorized a surge of 30,000 additional troops to Afghanistan. He ordered the military intervention in Libya that toppled Muammar Gaddafi, which created a massive security vacuum.
He sent troops back to Iraq.
Deployed U.S. forces back into Iraq and Syria to fight ISIS. He authorized the highly controversial targeted killing of a U.S. citizen, Anwar al-Awlaki. And most significantly, he vastly expanded the CIA and military drone strike programs, authorizing hundreds of strikes across multiple countries that weren't officially declared war zones. The anti-war candidate institutionalized remote warfare.
And the pattern continues right up to the present. Joe Biden finally pulled the plug on Afghanistan, executing the chaotic withdrawal to end that specific forever war, fulfilling a major promise. But almost immediately, he finds himself authorizing airstrikes against the Houthis to protect shipping lanes.
Striking Iranian-backed militias in Syria.
Right, authorizing the over-the-horizon drone strike that killed Ayman al-Zawahiri in Kabul, and funneling tens of billions of dollars in advanced military aid to sustain the war in Ukraine.
Which brings us directly to Donald Trump and Operation Epic Fury. He campaigned intensely on ending forever wars. He utilized incredibly sharp non-interventionist rhetoric, often criticizing the military-industrial complex and neoconservative foreign policy.
Wow.
Yet he has now initiated this massive multi-front campaign against Iran. So to answer your initial question, are they all just lying? Are campaign promises just cynical theater?
Well, the analysis argues it's much deeper than hypocrisy. It's about the crushing psychological weight of the information they receive once they gain access to the Situation Room.
That is the core of the argument. The campaign trail is built on theoretical optimism and broad ideologies. But the presidency is built on classified realities. The author asks us to imagine the daily routine.
Presidential daily brief.
Right. Every single morning, the President of the United States receives the brief. Intelligence officers hand over highly classified documents detailing terrifying, credible global threats. They read intercepts of terrorist cells plotting attacks on embassies.
They see satellite imagery of adversaries loading ballistic missiles.
They read human intelligence reports about extremist groups planning to target American citizens or critical infrastructure.
You are subjected to a daily diet of worst-case scenarios. The source argues that this constant, unrelenting exposure to real-time existential threats fundamentally and irreversibly shifts a president's perspective. The theoretical desire for peace is bulldozed by the immediate necessity of threat mitigation.
And there is a profound historical and psychological pressure at play here. The analysis points out a very specific fear that drives presidential decision-making. The fear of being remembered as weak consistently overpowers the fear of being labeled hawkish.
Interesting.
Think about the calculation. If you are presented with a 30% chance of a catastrophic attack on U.S. interests, you have two choices. You can exercise restraint, hoping the intelligence is wrong or the threat dissipates. But if you do nothing and the attack happens, you are the president who let Americans die. You are forever branded by the history books as negligent, weak, and culpable.
The political cost of inaction is perceived as fatal.
Exactly. On the other hand, if you overreact, if you launch a preemptive strike, if you order a bombing campaign, if you engage in a prolonged conflict, you might be criticized for being too aggressive. You might spark protests, but you will rarely be accused of failing to protect the nation.
You are seen as taking decisive action.
Yes. That structural psychological pressure to do something consistently overpowers the desire for restraint. The piece even lights a fascinating internal dynamic. Advisors who are explicitly brought into an administration because they possess a pro-peace or non-interventionist worldview rarely resign in protest when these massive escalations happen.
Right, which suggests that once they get security clearance, once they're on the inside looking at the raw intelligence, they internally accept the grim, violent realities of the international system. They realize the luxury of their campaign trail philosophy doesn't survive contact with the daily brief.
It's a sobering realization about the limits of democratic mandate versus the momentum of the national security apparatus.
It really is. It completely reframes how you look at the promises a candidate makes on a debate stage versus the realities of governing in a hostile world. But let's move from these broad structural pressures to the specific explosive catalyst of this current phase of the war. We have to talk about the decapitation strategy.
Specifically, the targeted killing of Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei.
Right, this is the inflection point. This is the event that has truly polarized the international community and deeply divided the analysts whose work we are synthesizing today.
This is where we see the most intense debate in the sources.
Let's lay out the pro-intervention argument first, because it is robust and unapologetic. Bret Stephens outlines this perspective in his piece, and his core thesis is that by joining Israel in this targeted attack and eliminating Khamenei, the United States essentially did the free world a massive favor.
Right.
He frames this intervention not as an escalation, but as a justified, strategic, and morally necessary act of ultimate deterrence.
And Stevens doesn't just rely on theoretical morality. He points to immediate, tangible reactions on the ground inside Iran to validate his stance. The sources detail extensive reports of Iranian citizens actively celebrating the assassination in major cities. Karaj, Tehran, Shiraz.
Yeah, you saw those reports.
For Stevens, these celebrations are the ultimate proof of concept. They provide visual, undeniable evidence that the regime is deeply, fundamentally unpopular, and that removing the authoritarian head of that regime was, in essence, a liberating act for a repressed Iranian populace. He views it as puncturing the aura of invincibility the regime had built.
Furthermore, Stevens roots his argument in a long, very dark historical context. He rejects the narrative that the U.S. and Israel started this current war. He argues that Iran has essentially been engaged in an asymmetric, undeclared war against the United States for decades.
He builds a compelling timeline of grievances to support that claim. He goes all the way back to the 1979 U.S. Embassy hostage crisis, which humiliated the Carter administration. He points to the 1983 Beirut barracks bombing, orchestrated by Iranian proxies, which killed 241 American service members.
And then there's the Iraq War.
Right. He brings up the deeply traumatic period of the Iraq War, where Iranian intelligence and the Quds Force actively supplied highly lethal, explosively formed penetrators, IEDs, to insurgents, specifically designed to pierce American armor and kill U.S. soldiers.
The argument is that for 40 years, Iran has acted aggressively and utilized asymmetric warfare because it genuinely believed it would never face ultimate existential consequences. They thought the West was too risk-averse to strike the leadership directly.
Exactly. And Stevens adds that Iran actively, repeatedly ignored golden opportunities to de-escalate. After previous, more limited strikes by the U.S. and Israel, instead of taking the hint and backing down, Iran chose to double down. They rebuilt their nuclear infrastructure, they expanded their ballistic missile capabilities.
So diplomacy was a dead end in his view.
From this viewpoint, waiting any longer for diplomacy to work was a fool's errand. It would have just provided Iran with the time to build thousands more advanced missiles and integrate even more sophisticated air defense systems received from Russia. Stevens argues that you cannot reason with the regime that views your restraint as weakness.
Right.
The only way to restore deterrence is to make the adversary genuinely, viscerally fear the consequences of their actions, and nothing instills fear like the targeted elimination of the supreme leader.
But, as we promised at the beginning, we have to look at the other side of the coin.
Yeah.
If you look at the historical data, there is a very sharp, highly critical counter-argument to this entire concept of a decapitation strategy.
Yes.
I want to play devil's advocate here. If restoring deterrence is as simple as taking out the top guy, why hasn't it worked perfectly every time we've tried it in the past?
That is the exact question Daoud Kuttab's analysis attempts to answer. Kuttab's core thesis acts as a direct rebuttal to Stevens. He argues that assassinating leaders in the Middle East historically backfires, almost without exception.
Yeah.
It might provide a massive, short-term political high for the leaders who ordered the strike, a bump in the polls, a momentary feeling of victory. But it consistently leads to long-term instability, radicalization, and strategic disaster.
Let's dissect the historical examples Kuttab provides because they are incredibly illuminating. Start with Iraq.
Iraq is the ultimate cautionary tale of decapitation. The U.S. invaded, removed Saddam Hussein from power, and he was eventually executed. In a literal sense, the decapitation was successful. It permanently ended his brutal regime.
But the fallout.
But what was the long-term structural result? It didn't usher in a stable pro-Western democracy. It completely dismantled the Iraqi state security apparatus, creating a massive, chaotic power vacuum. That vacuum became the ultimate breeding ground for radicalization, directly leading to the rise of al-Qaeda in Iraq, which eventually morphed into ISIS.
And it helped Iran.
Ironically, by removing Saddam, who was Iran's greatest regional counterweight, the U.S. inadvertently cleared the path for a massive, unprecedented expansion of pro-Iranian political factions and Shia militia forces inside Iraq. The action intended to stabilize the region handed Iran its greatest strategic victory.
Okay, but Iraq was a full-scale invasion. What about targeted assassinations of non-state actors? Qutb points to Hamas as a prime example.
The Hamas example perfectly illustrates the concept of bureaucratic resilience. Israel assassinated the foundational spiritual leader of Hamas, Sheikh Ahmed Yassin. Shortly after, they assassinated his immediate successor, Abdel Aziz Rantisi. Two massive blows to the leadership structure. Did the organization collapse?
Yeah.
Did the ideology vanish? No. The bureaucracy absorbed the shock. The leadership mantle eventually passed down to figures like Yahya Sinwar.
Who's much more hardline.
Sinwar wasn't a spiritual figurehead. He was a hardened, ruthless militant who learned his enemy's tactics intimately while spending decades in Israeli prisons. The assassination of the founders paved the way for the architect of the devastating October 7 attacks. The decapitation merely accelerated the evolution of the group into a more lethal entity.
And the analysis of Hezbollah follows the exact same trajectory, doesn't it?
It is perhaps the most stark example of all. Back in the early 1990s, Israel assassinated the leader of Hezbollah, Abbas al-Musawi. At the time, it was viewed as a major tactical triumph. But look at what happened next.
Hassan Nasrallah.
His replacement was a younger, incredibly charismatic, and deeply strategic cleric named Hassan Nasrallah. Under Nasrallah's decades of leadership, Hezbollah didn't just survive, it transformed. It went from a localized militant group to a massive, heavily armed, highly disciplined paramilitary state within a state in Lebanon, possessing an arsenal of precision-guided missiles capable of targeting any point in Israel. Qutb's fundamental point is that assassinations only eliminate individuals. They do not eliminate the underlying political movements, the historical grievances, the deeply ingrained ideologies, or the bureaucratic structures that sustain these groups. Often, it just elevates more radical, vengeance-driven lieutenants who turn the slain leader into a powerful martyr.
Which brings us directly to the massive risk associated with killing Ali Khamenei right now.
Yes. The sources highlight a severe, immediate succession risk. Khamenei was elderly. He was reportedly ailing. The regime had already been quietly preparing for a transition of power. And crucially, there were credible reports, which we will discuss more in the diplomatic section, that Khamenei, despite his rhetoric, was actually open to making significant nuclear concessions to ease the crushing economic sanctions before his death.
But now, that option is off the table.
Completely. The risk now is that the internal power struggle to replace him won't be won by a pragmatist looking for sanctions relief. It will likely be won by the most radical hardline elements within the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC. The new leader, whoever emerges from the chaos, might feel compelled to prove their strength by being far more radical and entirely closed off to any diplomatic negotiations with the West. If the regime's central authority collapses entirely, you don't magically get a neat, functional democracy. You get a security vacuum. You get warlords. You get a scenario akin to Libya or Syria, but with vast stockpiles of ballistic missiles and enriched uranium loose in the chaos.
If the historical data so clearly shows that these decapitation strategies consistently backfire and elevate more radical elements, it begs the question, why do leaders keep ordering them? Are they not reading the same history books, or is there an entirely different calculation at play?
That brings us to the domestic political motivations, which the sources analyze deeply. Often, foreign policy is just domestic policy conducted by other means. This war, and specifically this high-profile assassination, heavily serves the immediate short-term political needs of both Benjamin Netanyahu and Donald Trump.
Let's look at Netanyahu first. The sources point out his incredibly precarious domestic situation. He has been facing intense internal political pressure, a fragile governing coalition, the trauma of recent intelligence failures, and ongoing, serious corruption charges.
For a leader in that highly vulnerable position, a major, undeniable wartime victory, particularly the elimination of a long-standing existential nemesis like Khamenei, is a political lifeline. It shifts the national narrative from domestic failures to existential survival. It forces political opponents to rally around the flag.
It's survival politics.
The analysis strongly implies that short-term political survival and legacy building are heavily weighting the calculus of Israeli decision-making, perhaps overriding concerns about long-term regional stability.
And for Donald Trump, the calculus is equally complex. He desires a definitive, historic victory. He wants to be the president who definitively solved the Iran problem that bedeviled his predecessors. But the sources note, this is a massive, high-wire political gamble. By launching a massive Middle Eastern conflict, he is actively risking alienating a massive segment of his own core America First political base.
You see the fractures immediately. You have figures deeply entrenched in the Maggio movement, like Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene, aggressively arguing that this intervention violates the foundational principle of staying out of foreign entanglements and focusing resources domestically.
We also have the progressive left.
Right. You have progressive stalwarts like Senator Elizabeth Warren warning of the disastrous consequences of sliding into another trillion-dollar forever war. And you have civil liberties organizations like the ACLU raising severe constitutional concerns, pointing out the dangerous precedent of the executive branch engaging in such a massive, sustained conflict without explicit formal congressional approval.
Strange bedfellows.
It's a bizarre political alignment where the far right and the progressive left are finding common ground in their opposition to the executive branch's military actions.
It's an incredibly tangled web of motivations. You have the structural pressure of the presidency, the desire to restore deterrence, the historical risk of radicalization, and the immediate need for domestic political victories all colliding at once. But what if we are looking at this through the wrong lens entirely?
How so?
What if the goal isn't just about stopping a nuclear program or responding to proxy attacks or winning the next election cycle? What if the objective is vastly more ambitious? What if the goal is completely redrawing the map of the Middle East?
This is where the analysis takes a truly fascinating and somewhat controversial turn. We have to examine Abbas Nassir's analysis. He argues that this war, despite all the press briefings and official rhetoric focusing on centrifuges and uranium, is not actually about the Iranian nuclear program.
That sounds counterintuitive given the stated goals. Unpack Nassir's logic for us.
It's a critical pivot in understanding the overarching strategic landscape. Nassir points out a glaring inconsistency in the narrative. President Trump, during his previous term, unilaterally withdrew the United States from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iran Nuclear Agreement.
The JCPOA, right?
If the primary overriding concern of the administration was purely preventing a nuclear Iran, the most logical low-risk path would have been to maintain that diplomatic framework, enforce the rigorous inspections, and keep the program boxed in.
Right. If you just want to stop the bomb, you keep the inspectors in the building.
Exactly. Therefore, Nassir argues, the shifting red lines we are seeing, where the goalposts keep moving from containing the nuclear program to demanding changes in ballistic missile production, to demanding the total cessation of proxy support, to now advocating for regime change, indicate a much grander, unspoken objective.
Which
Nassir posits that the true goal is fundamentally reshaping the geopolitical architecture of the Middle East to secure unquestioned, permanent Israeli regional dominance and American hegemony, permanently eliminating any state actor capable of challenging that order.
And when you start looking at the rhetoric coming out of the diplomatic corps, it seems to actively support this idea of a shifting, highly expansive agenda that goes way beyond neutralizing military targets. The sources highlight a major, highly explosive diplomatic incident that occurred recently involving the U.S. ambassador to Israel, Mike Huckabee.
This was a revealing moment. Ambassador Huckabee publicly claimed in an interview that Israel has, quote, biblical rights to large swaths of the Middle East.
Which is an incredibly loaded phrase to use in that region.
It is the geopolitical equivalent of throwing a match into a powder keg. Using theological justification for territorial rights completely circumvents international law, established borders, and decades of diplomatic agreements. That kind of rhetoric sparked absolute immediate outrage across the Muslim world.
I can imagine.
But crucially, it didn't just anger adversaries. It terrified key allies. Gulf states like Saudi Arabia and the UAE, who've been carefully balancing their security ties to the U.S. with their own domestic public opinion, were furious. It forced Secretary of State Marco Rubio to scramble, engaging in massive rapid response and damage control, reassuring allies that U.S. policy had not shifted toward endorsing annexation based on scripture.
But despite Rubio's damage control, the concept of expansion is clearly in the air. Let's look at the specific strategic blueprints provided in the sources, specifically the document discussing the Greater Israel paradigm. When people hear Greater Israel, they immediately envision tanks rolling across borders and armies planting flags in neighboring capitals. But we need to clarify a crucial distinction here, right?
Yes, this is absolutely vital to understand. When modern strategic analysts in these documents talk about Greater Israel in this specific contemporary context, they are emphatically not talking about literal territorial takeover. They're not talking about expanding the physical borders of the state through military conquest.
So no annexation of neighboring countries.
Correct. The source material argues that direct military occupation is now viewed by military planners as an obsolete, incredibly self-defeating tool of statecraft. The historical lessons of the late 20th and early 21st centuries are simply too painful and too expensive to ignore.
Let's review those lessons because they inform everything happening right now.
Look at the American experience. The U.S. spent trillions of dollars, lost thousands of American lives, and caused the deaths of hundreds of thousands of civilians attempting to occupy and nation-build in Iraq and Afghanistan. And ultimately, those direct occupations failed to produce stable, compliant, pro-Western democracies. They produced insurgencies, corruption, and eventual withdrawal.
And Israel has its own bitter, very localized history with the failures of occupation.
Exactly. Israel endured an 18-year, grueling, highly unpopular guerrilla war in southern Lebanon, occupying a security zone that ultimately just fueled the rise of Hezbollah and ended in a unilateral withdrawal in 2000. Furthermore, they experienced the continuous, draining security burdens, the international diplomatic isolation, and the moral cost that came with their direct ground presence inside Gaza before their disengagement in 2005.
So the lesson is clear.
The consensus among the strategists drafting these new blueprints is clear. Direct rule over hostile populations fails. It is a relic of the past. It provokes relentless insurgencies, drains economic resources, and ruins international standing.
Okay, so if direct territorial conquest is permanently off the table because it's too costly, but you still want to achieve total regional dominance and neutralize all threats, what is the new blueprint? How do you control the map without owning the territory?
The sources outline what they call the proxy state model. This is the new architecture of dominance. It is entirely about elite co-option rather than territorial conquest. Instead of invading a country, fighting an insurgency, and trying to build a new government from scratch, the goal is to utilize intense pressure to install or prop up compliant, deeply dependent leadership at the very top of neighboring states.
It's a shift from nation building, which is messy and expensive, to elite shaping, which is highly targeted.
Precisely. The strategy involves utilizing a combination of severe economic sanctions, diplomatic isolation, targeted military pressure, or even covert coordinated efforts to facilitate the removal of uncooperative heads of state. The objective is to position figureheads whose very political and sometimes physical survival depends entirely on their quiet alignment with Washington and Jerusalem.
But a single leader is fragile. They can be overthrown or change their mind.
Which is why the model goes deeper than just the head of state. It relies on surrounding that compliant leader with a dense network of sympathetic advisors, intelligence directors, military chiefs, and finance ministers who are thoroughly vetted, trained, and often co-opted by Western intelligence agencies. So, even if the primary leader wavers or faces a domestic crisis, the actual functional levers of state power, the military, the money, the secret police, are held by reliable hands who understand where their interests lie.
But wait, I have to play devil's advocate again. Let's say you successfully install this compliant elite in a neighboring country. How do you permanently enforce their loyalty without an occupying army standing behind them to ensure they don't flip back to an adversary? What is the actual mechanism of control?
Economic and technological weaponization. This is the most insidious and brilliant part of the blueprint. The sources explicitly point to the Abraham Accords as the perfect, scalable template for this model.
Let's dive into that, because usually the Abraham Accords are discussed purely as diplomatic breakthroughs, shaking hands on the White House lawn, direct flights, normalization. But this analysis takes a much more clinical view.
The analysis views the diplomacy as the packaging. The technology is the payload. The true strategic value of the Abraham Accords isn't just peace treaties. It's about making the regional economies of these Arab states utterly, inextricably dependent on Israeli technological innovation and U.S. financial integration.
Walk me through the mechanics of that. If I'm a Gulf state leader, how am I trapped?
Think about the existential needs of these states. We are talking about critical survival-level infrastructure. Many of these nations exist in hyper-arid climates. They desperately need advanced water desalination technology to survive. They need cutting-edge agricultural tech to feed their populations as climate change worsens.
Security, too.
And, perhaps most importantly for the survival of autocratic regimes, they need the absolute most advanced cybersecurity and surveillance apparatuses available to monitor dissidents and protect their banking sectors.
And Israel is a world leader in all three of those sectors.
Exactly. So if a state signs on, their entire digital infrastructure, their municipal water supply, their agricultural output, and their internal security apparatus become deeply integrated with and dependent upon Israeli tech firms and U.S. investment. It operates like Apple's walled garden ecosystem. Once your entire country is running on their operating system, you can't just plug in a cheap third-party component from a rival nation without risking a catastrophic system failure.
It creates an invisible, unbreakable chain.
Yes. It creates a web of dependency that acts as an incredibly powerful, entirely non-lethal deterrent against any anti-Western policies. You don't ever need to threaten them with an invasion of U.S. Marines. If a proxy state starts voting against U.S. interests at the UN or flirts with allowing Chinese military bases, you don't send tanks. You just quietly threaten to delay the software updates for their desalination plants. You threaten to pull the U.S. investment backing their tech sector. You restrict their access to the cyber tools, keeping their regime safe. It is a completely new precedent for global affairs, where national sovereignty literally becomes conditional on technological and economic alignment.
That is a staggering shift in how superpower warfare and regional dominance are conceptualized. Invisible chains of digital, agricultural, and economic leverage replacing the blunt force of military occupation. But to establish that grand vision of a compliant, tech-dependent Middle East, the U.S. and Israel have to actually win the current kinetic war first.
Right, the war's going on right now.
Which brings us to the brutal reality of the endurance contest. Who outlasts whom in Operation Epic Fury? Can the U.S. and Israel sustain a prolonged, massive bombing campaign without fracturing their own domestic coalitions, or will Iran simply absorb the blows and survive long enough to wait them out?
This is where Daniel Byman's military analysis becomes highly relevant. When you look at the logistics of the current U.S. force buildup in the region, the deployment of carrier strike groups, the positioning of strategic bombers, it looks designed for a high-intensity, relatively short-term sprint. It is designed for maximum initial shock and awe. It is not structurally or politically designed for a grueling, multi-year, prolonged war of attrition.
And what is Iran's strategy? Do they think they can shoot down enough U.S. planes to win?
Iran knows it cannot win a conventional head-to-head military confrontation with the United States. Their strategy is incredibly simple and historically proven. Survive. They don't have to defeat the U.S. military, they just have to not capitulate.
Wait them out.
The sources remind us of a vital precedent. Iran previously survived a devastating 12-day, high-intensity leadership decapitation strike campaign. The infrastructure was hammered, leaders were killed, but the state kept functioning. The analysis suggests that without a massive U.S. ground invasion, which is the one thing absolutely no politician in Washington wants to authorize, even historically heavy airstrike losses and infrastructure destruction may simply not be enough to fundamentally topple the deeply entrenched regime.
And that reality ties directly into the U.S. administration's stated objective of sparking a citizen uprising. The strategic theory is that the external military pressure from the bombing will crack the regime's security apparatus, create chaos, and the Iranian people will seize the moment to finish the job from the inside. But the sources highlight the incredibly grim, bloody reality of placing hope in that strategy.
Yes, the core premise is true. The regime is undeniably deeply unpopular among a vast swath of its population. The severe social repression, the morality police, the crushing economic hardship caused by corruption and sanctions, all of it has created a tinderbox of resentment. We saw that during the massive protests in recent years. But the analysis points out a fatal flaw in the uprising strategy. The opposition is largely unarmed and entirely unorganized on a national military level.
While the regime has all the guns.
Exactly, and crucially, the regime has proven time and time again, without any hesitation, that it is willing to use extreme, lethal, indiscriminate violence against its own citizens to maintain power. They will shut off the internet and order the IRGC and the Basij militia to use live ammunition on crowds. The sources warn very strongly against the profound historical and moral danger of a superpower offering false hope to a vulnerable populace.
We have to unpack that because the historical precedents they reference are heartbreaking. They point specifically to the Hungarian Revolution in 1956 and the uprisings in Iraq in 1991.
Those are the exact parallels military historians dread. In 1956, the U.S., through Radio Free Europe, heavily encouraged the Hungarian people to rise up against their Soviet-backed government, heavily implying that Western military support would arrive to help them. The citizens rose up, fought bravely, but the Western support never materialized. The Soviet tanks rolled into Budapest, and thousands of Hungarians were slaughtered.
And the Iraq example in 1991 is even closer to home.
After the U.S. decimated Saddam Hussein's army during the Gulf War, President George H.W. Bush explicitly called for the Iraqi military and the Iraqi people to take matters into their own hands and force Saddam out. The Shia population in the south and the Kurdish population in the north took him at his word and launched massive uprisings.
But the U.S. didn't back them up.
No, the U.S. decided not to intervene further or march on Baghdad. They stood by as Saddam utilized his surviving helicopter gunships to brutally, systematically crush the rebellions, resulting in tens of thousands of deaths and massive refugee crises. Encouraging a civilian uprising from a podium in Washington without fully committing to providing direct, sustained ground support risks massive, catastrophic bloodshed without any strategic follow-through.
But let's play this out to its ultimate conclusion. Let's imagine the U.S. pressure campaign works. Let's imagine the citizen uprising is successful, the IRGC fractures, and the clerical regime utterly collapses. We won, right? But we also have to consider the day after scenario. What actually happens if the regime falls? The analysts warn very starkly against the naive expectation of a neat transition to a stable, liberal democracy.
The modern history of the Middle East has shown repeatedly that removing a deeply entrenched autocracy rarely results in a Jeffersonian democracy. It almost always leads to profound, violent disorder.
The sources outline some genuinely chilling possibilities for the day after. One major scenario is state fragmentation. We often think of Iran as a single, unified monolith, but the demographics tell a different story.
It is incredibly ethnically diverse. Persians make up a slight majority, but there are massive minority populations with deep historical grievances against the central government in Tehran. If the iron grip of the central security apparatus suddenly vanishes, the country could rapidly break apart along those ethnic fault lines.
Of shatters.
You have the Azeris concentrated in the northwest, the Kurds, who have long sought autonomy in the west, the Arab populations in the oil-rich southwest region of Khuzestan, and the Balak people in the impoverished southeast near the Pakistani border.
So instead of a new democracy, you could be looking at a multi-factional, devastating civil war akin to what happened in Syria or Libya, but on a much larger, more heavily armed scale.
Precisely. And the other highly plausible scenario detailed in the forecasting documents is what some analysts grimly refer to as Islamic Republic 2.0.
Which sounds contradictory. How does the regime fall but survive?
The clerical leadership, the ayatollahs, the religious councils might fall or be swept aside by popular anger. But the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps is not just a military unit. It is an incredibly powerful, deeply entrenched syndicate that controls vast swaths of the Iranian economy, the heavy industries, the borders, and the military hardware.
They hold the real power.
In a moment of absolute chaos, the IOGC leadership might simply decide to stage a hard coup, jettison the unpopular religious clerics to appease the public momentarily, and establish a pure secular military dictatorship. They would strip away any pretense of the religious or democratic elements of the current system, ruling entirely through martial law. Either of these outcomes, a fragmented, bleeding civil war or a hardened, desperate military junta, would likely drastically worsen regional instability and fail to solve any of the U.S.'s core security or nuclear concerns.
And while all of this complex geopolitical chess is being played, while we debate uprisings and proxy states, there is a massive, relentless ticking clock hanging over the entire operation, the global economy. Thomas Friedman's analysis zeroes in on the oil factor, and his data model suggests that the commodities markets might actually dictate the length and outcome of this war far more than any military strategy drafted in the Pentagon.
It comes down to the brutal math of global energy. 20% of all global oil trade passes through the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow choke point right off the coast of Iran.
And if this war becomes prolonged, or if Iran, feeling existentially threatened, decides to retaliate not just against military targets, but by actively targeting international oil shipping, mining the strait, or launching missile strikes at the massive Gulf energy infrastructure in Saudi Arabia or the UAE, the economic shockwaves would be immediate, global, and catastrophic.
Friedman points out that the data models aren't just predicting a temporary minor price fluctuation at the pump. If Hormuz is compromised, his forecasting models suggest oil prices could rapidly spike to $150 a barrel.
We have to imagine what that actually does to the real world. If oil hits $150 a barrel, it instantly causes massive cascading inflation across the United States, Europe, and Asia. It's not just the cost of filling your car. It's the cost of aviation fuel, the cost of manufacturing plastics, the cost of transporting every single piece of food and consumer goods across the country. Supply chains would seize up. And if American voters, who were promised economic renewal, are suddenly paying exorbitant prices at the gas pump and seeing the cost of basic groceries skyrocket, how long do you think public support for a war halfway across the world will last?
It will evaporate almost overnight. The U.S. domestic front, particularly the populist political base that just put the administration in office expecting an America First economy, might demand an immediate, unconditional end to the conflict. The economic reality at home could force the administration into premature negotiations long before any of their grand strategic goals regarding the nuclear program or the proxy states are ever met.
Which brings us to the final and perhaps most expansive layer of this entire crisis, the global chessboard. This is emphatically not just a regional conflict between Israel, the U.S., and Iran. The global superpowers are heavily, deeply involved, and the diplomatic scramble happening behind the scenes right now is frantic.
Absolutely. The sources detail how Russia, China, and Turkey are actively, aggressively pushing for an immediate end to the hostilities. The stakes are simply too high for them to remain passive observers. Let's look at Turkey's maneuvering first, because it highlights the profound regional panic.
President Erdogan is aggressively condemning both sides in public, which is his usual style. But behind the scenes, his foreign minister, Hakan Fidan, is engaging in what the diplomatic cables call intense, multi-vector diplomacy.
Turkey is terrified. They share a massive porous land border with Iran. Fidan is on the phone with everyone, the U.S. State Department, the UK, Qatari mediators, Greek officials, and even Kurdish regional representatives in Iraq. He is desperately trying to construct a diplomatic off-ramp.
Because of the refugees.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Turkey knows that if the Iranian state fragments or if the economy totally collapses under bombardment, they are going to face a tidal wave of millions of desperate refugees crossing their border, triggering an economic and political crisis inside Turkey that Erdogan might not survive.
But the clash of narratives between the true superpowers, China and the U.S., is where the great power competition really comes into sharp focus. You have this incredible public spat playing out. China's foreign minister, Wang Yi, has been actively claiming in international forums that back-channel U.S.-Iran negotiations regarding the nuclear program were actually showing genuine, measurable progress right before the military campaign unexpectedly interrupted them.
It's a very deliberate narrative strategy by Beijing. By claiming diplomacy was working, Wang Yi is actively framing the United States as the impulsive, warmongering aggressor who abandoned a viable, peaceful resolution to launch an unnecessary war. It paints China as the responsible adult in the room.
But the U.S. is not taking that accusation quietly. Steve Witkoff, the lead U.S. negotiator who was actually in the room for those back-channel talks, fiercely publicly countered Wang Yi's claim. Witkoff stated flatly that the talks were incredibly tense, hostile, and entirely unproductive. He alleged that instead of negotiating in good faith, Iranian officials were actively boasting during these meetings about successfully evading international safeguards and bragging that they already possessed enough highly enriched uranium to construct 11 nuclear warheads.
It's a war of information as much as a war of munitions. Who do the unaligned nations of the world believe? The U.S. claiming imminent nuclear threat or China claiming U.S. sabotage of diplomacy? And amidst all this high-level geopolitical maneuvering, you have the profound, almost tragic irony of Oman.
Oman is fascinating. They have traditionally been the quiet, neutral mediator in the region, the Switzerland of the Middle East, constantly passing messages between Washington and Tehran. And according to the sources, they are still actively calling for a ceasefire, still trying to broker peace, even as their own sovereign territory has been targeted and hit by Iranian retaliatory strikes. They're trying to negotiate a peace treaty while the bombs are literally falling on their heads.
It speaks to the desperation to contain the fire. But if we connect this diplomatic maneuvering to the bigger picture, to the blueprints we discussed earlier, we realize that the U.S. and Israeli strategy isn't just about neutralizing Iran as an isolated threat. It is specifically, structurally aimed at countering China's massive, expanding influence in the Middle East. The sources outline how the proxy state model, the technological walled garden we discussed.
Okay, I want to push back on this again. How does that actually work in practice? How do you block a trillion-dollar global economic initiative without using military force against China or launching a trade war? If China's pockets are infinitely deeper than anyone else's, why wouldn't these proxy states just play both sides? Why wouldn't they take the U.S. security guarantees and the Israeli cyber tech and take the massive Chinese infrastructure money to build their ports and 5G networks? What's actually stopping them from double-dipping?
That is the exact vulnerability the U.S. strategy targets. It's what the geopolitical analysts call creating a sovereignty trap. China's stated foreign policy of strict non-interference in other countries' internal human rights affairs makes them a very attractive, no-strings-attached partner for authoritarian regimes in the Middle East. They offer loans without lectures on democracy.
Right.
The U.S. cannot compete on those terms, so they counter this by controlling what they call the technological on-ramps.
Meaning the core infrastructure.
Exactly. The systems are mutually exclusive. If the U.S. and Israel successfully integrate a regional economy into their high-tech and security ecosystems, it makes it technologically and politically impossible for China to deeply integrate its own systems. Let's go back to the walled garden analogy.
Okay.
If an Arab state's banking sector is protected by Israeli cybersecurity and their military intelligence is shared on U.S.-built cloud servers, the United States will simply mandate, as a condition of that alliance, that the state cannot use Huawei to build its 5G networks, and it cannot allow Chinese state-owned enterprises to build and operate its deep-water ports. The security risks of Chinese espionage penetrating the U.S.-Israeli tech bubble are too high.
So, by forcing them to adopt Western critical infrastructure, you essentially lock China out of the physical and digital real estate of the country.
Precisely. A government that relies entirely on U.S. security guarantees and Israeli cyber tech to survive an Iranian threat is not going to sign a massive, highly sensitive 50-year infrastructure deal with Beijing that would enrage Washington. The ultimate goal of this grand strategy is to keep Chinese influence in the Middle East purely transactional, buying oil and selling cheap consumer goods, preventing it from ever translating into genuine, deeply rooted political, technological, or military leverage.
And Iran is a massive central piece of that puzzle because Iran refuses to play by those rules. Iran is a central pillar in what Bret Stephens explicitly described in his op-ed as an axis of autocracies. Iran is deeply strategically aligned with both Russia and China.
They are the logistical linchpin of that axis. Iran is currently operating as the primary armory for Russia, supplying the thousands of cheap, lethal Shahed drones that Russia is using daily to devastate Ukraine's energy grid. Simultaneously, Iran is supplying millions of barrels of heavily discounted, sanctioned oil to China, fueling the Chinese industrial engine under a massive 25-year strategic partnership agreement.
So taking out Iran does a lot more than just secure Israel.
From the perspective of the strategists in Washington, weakening or completely toppling the Iranian regime isn't just a regional victory. It is a massive two-for-one global strike. It permanently removes a regional nuclear threat, and simultaneously, it severely fractures this broader, anti-democratic global bloc that is actively challenging American hegemony in Europe and Asia.
Which is causing immense, palpable anxiety among all the neighboring states who realize they are caught in the middle of a proxy war between global superpowers. Every action triggers a recalculation. Look at Saudi Arabia. They are watching the destruction in Iran incredibly closely. The sources note that Saudi Arabia is demanding a high price for their continued alignment.
They want a Palestinian state.
Right. They have demanded a tangible, irreversible pathway to an independent Palestinian state before they will agree to fully normalize relations with Israel or fully commit to this U.S.-led tech coalition. They are precariously balancing their desperate reliance on the U.S. security umbrella against the boiling anger of their own populace over the Palestinian issue.
And then there is Pakistan, which is facing perhaps the most terrifying strategic dilemma of any nation not directly involved in the fighting. The intelligence forecasts highlight that Pakistan is deeply, existentially concerned about a two-front threat emerging from this reshaped map.
Because while the U.S. is focused on the Middle East, alliances are shifting in South Asia.
Exactly. Israel is actively, aggressively wooing India, led by Prime Minister Narendra Modi. They are seeking stronger security cooperation, intelligence sharing, and arms deals. Pakistan watches this and fears the emergence of a powerful, hostile alliance between its nuclear-armed arch-rival India and a newly dominant, untouchable Israel-U.S. bloc. The strategic analysis suggests that if Pakistan feels cornered and isolated by this new Western alignment, they might feel compelled to fully secure their own nuclear assets and lean heavily, irrevocably into deep defense and economic ties with China and Russia just to balance the scales and ensure their own survival.
It's a perfect, terrifying illustration of how a conflict in one specific country, bombs falling on missile silos in Iran, reverberates through the supply chains of China, the battlefields of Ukraine, and the nuclear calculus of South Asia. Every single action triggers a massive recalculation by every other major player on the board.
It is the definition of a cascading geopolitical crisis.
So let's bring this all together. We have covered a massive amount of ground. What is the ultimate so what of everything we've unpacked today? The core realization is that Operation Epic Fury is unimaginably complex. It is far, far more than just a series of tactical airstrikes on military sites. It is a high-stakes, incredibly dangerous gamble by the United States and Israel to fundamentally, permanently rewire the geopolitical, economic, and technological dependencies of the entire Middle East.
And the risks inherent in this gamble are monumental. We are looking at the very real potential for devastating ethnic balkanization and civil war inside Iran, the looming threat of massive, crippling global inflation driven by a sudden spike in oil prices if the Strait of Hormuz is closed, and the undeniable historical reality that attempting to remove hostile leaders through force often simply paves the way for even more radical, unpredictable successions.
For you listening right now, taking this all in, this deep dive serves as a stark reminder of two things. First, it shows how quickly and inevitably campaign promises of peace, isolationism, and restraint dissolve when a president is actually confronted with the structural pressures of the office and the terrifying intelligence briefings in the Situation Room. The system demands action.
It really does.
Second, it proves that while this conflict is happening halfway across the world, it is deeply, inextricably connected to your daily life. A prolonged war isn't just a headline. It could directly impact your wallet at the gas pump tomorrow, drive up inflation on everything you buy, and fundamentally disrupt the global supply chains that deliver the goods you rely on every single day.
It perfectly highlights how interconnected our global vulnerabilities truly are. A drone strike in Tehran can impact a mortgage rate in Ohio.
As we wrap up this deep dive, we want to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over. We spent a significant amount of time discussing the strategic shift away from traditional military occupation, the old model of boots on the ground, tanks in the streets, and messy nation building, toward this new, highly sophisticated proxy state model. A model entirely reliant on elite co-option, technological reliance, and inescapable cyber dependency.
Right.
If this new blueprint for indirect control actually succeeds in reshaping the Middle East, will it become the permanent new standard for superpower warfare across the globe? Could we literally be witnessing the end of the era of traditional territorial conquest? Will future empires bother invading countries? Or will they simply rely on invisible chains of digital, agricultural, and economic leverage to control the world?
It's a chilling thought, but one that the current geopolitical trends strongly suggest we need to prepare for. The wars of the future might be won entirely in the cloud.
Something to think about as you watch the headlines unfold and the map rewrite itself. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We'll be back to unpack the next layer of our complex world soon. Keep questioning, keep learning.